all the changes that have been made over the last year, a few months or so, could not fit in one session. So here we are breaking it up. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me see, present from current slide. Let's see here. And then if y'all can see my screen, give me a yes in the chat. Or give me a thumbs up, obviously, since we got folks. Perfect, 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 perfect. All right, all right. Great, great, great. So here's what we're gonna do. Perfect. I'm gonna be honest with y'all. I'm not a fan of how Canva presents, but here we are. All right, so session 2, get it in writing. Mastering the seller commission agreements, the compensation agreements is our discussion today. Again, like I said, it's not gonna take us long to get through this. This is our opportunity to stack, right, what we learned 2 weeks ago regarding the buyer's brokerage agreement. All of this is part and parcel of the buyer's brokerage agreement. For those who I have not had an opportunity to meet before, this is your first time joining us on a Thursday. We've been doing this on Thursdays for a very long time. We are now doing it under the Purchase Ready umbrella because there's a whole ecosystem of support that we're building for you guys. Previously, many of you who knew me before, we still have title experts. And so our branding was under the Experts University. Well, the market has changed, the industry has changed, and there's a different need. And I'll be perfectly honest with you guys, it's at the beginning of the process, how we're dealing with our buyers. It's a different conversation that we have to have with them. There's a different level of specialization that you as a realtor, you need to be strong on so that you can ensure that you don't lose control of your business, right? And so that's what our focus is going forward. And I'm super excited. I got to tell you guys, I'm super excited. Over the last few months, I've been really just looking at the changes, looking at the changes in the documents, looking at the changes in the industry, looking at the changes in financing opportunities for buyers, looking at what sellers are looking for when they accept offers for buyers. And whereas some may be overwhelmed, I'm excited because this is an opportunity for you guys to really make a tremendous impact in the industry. All right. So I got ahead of myself. I'm Ray Cole. For those who I have not had a chance to meet before, I'm a South Florida real estate attorney. Again, previously, many knew me through Experts University under the Title Experts brand. I'm originally from Florida. I attended the University of Florida. Then I attended Santa Clara University School of Law in California, came back home to Florida, got my LLM in real property development from the University of Miami. I am a Florida real estate licensed Florida real estate sales professional. I am a licensed loan officer, can do business in all 50 states. And I just have this awesome opportunity to gather and meet with you guys each Thursday to impart a nugget concerning your business, right? And how to move forward in your business in a professional manner, right? So today, again, we are going to discuss the seller commission agreements. Why is this important? This is going to be more important, guys. This is probably the most important topic this year. And the reason why it's the most important topic is because it has created a few more documents that must be executed, about 4, right? Counting, including the contract, that must be executed for you guys to really ensure that you're documenting who's being compensated, how they're being compensated, right? As it relates to the buyer's agent, seller's agent, right? And like I said, who's paying for it? This is important. I'm gonna tell you guys, this is so important. If you mess this up, it's gonna be a problem. I don't like to scare people, but if you mess this up, it's gonna be a problem, right? And so last week we talked about, you already understand step 1, when you're working with the buyer, you have to have a buyer's brokerage agreement executed. You know that. We're clear on that. And we went over the various types of buyer's brokerage agreement. Today, it's important for you to understand that without an executed seller compensation agreement, The seller is not bound to compensate the buyer's agent. That's why this entire series is titled Get It in Writing. Get it in writing, because if a seller, if a seller or seller's agent says, oh yeah, they've been trying to sell this house for so long, they'll pay you $50,000. Well, if you don't get it in writing, guess what you're going to be paid by that seller? Zero. Everything from last week forward, I want you guys to think, get it in writing. Is this in writing, right? Is this in writing? So, recap. First step is the buyer's brokerage agreement, right? We know that we have what I like to describe a meeting of the minds. We know that no longer when you're working with the buyer, do you kind of just get a phone call and say, yeah, meet me over there at 123 Main Street, I'll show you the house. Well, you can, but be prepared to have at least a little conversation on maybe the hood of your car, or maybe with your iPad where they sign a buyer's brokerage agreement, because we know that you are required, right, to have a buyer's brokerage agreement executed before you show property, both physically and virtually, right? So that's step one. So we went over that last week. We went over those various agreements, right? And so step two, these were the agreements we went over. The transaction broker exclusive buyer's brokerage agreement. We talked about how that gives you the opportunity to essentially represent both buyer and seller in a single transaction. We went over the seller agent exclusive buyer brokerage agreement, where you're saying to that buyer, I'm going to work with you singularly. I'm not going to work with a seller as well on a single transaction. Not to say you're not going to work with another buyer, but I'm not going to work in one particular transaction. I am not going to represent both the seller and you, right? Exclusive buyer brokerage agreement with consent to transition to transaction broker relationship. So that says, well, we're starting off as a single agent. I'm only representing, my intent is to only represent you. However, in this agreement, you consent to us transitioning to transaction in the event that, let's say, for example, they're interested in purchasing one of your listings, right? So now, for all intents and purposes, I agree that we intend for me to only represent you in a particular transaction. However, you agree, and you agree to consent, you consent to transition to transaction broker if a transaction requires that. No agency relationship, right? That's saying that I'm simply providing you with the professional required rep services of a buyer's agent, right? But I'm not your fiduciary. Not that. I am going to give you what is required of me as a licensed real estate professional, right? Then we talked about the modifications to the buyer's brokerage agreements that are possible. We talked about the showing agreement, where, let's say, for example, someone comes in town, for whatever reason, you all have not agreed to be their agent for a specific time period exclusively. But you say, well, they have 5 properties and let's see how it works. I agree to show you these 5 properties. If you purchase one of these 5 properties, then I'll be compensated. But outside of that, that's the extent of our agreement and our representation, right? And then we have the property pre-touring agreement, which is, look at that as if someone contacts you off of Zillow, right? And they are just determined they don't want to go through this whole buyer's consultation with you. I literally, Kim, I just need to see that property. Can you show me that property? And you tried all your best to get them into a formal agreement, right? Exclusive agreement, but they won't. You say, fine, here's the property pre-touring agreement, because I know I must at least do this the right way. Okay, so that was the property pre-touring agreement. Now, that's done. Let's say Kim, she gets the transaction broker agreement executed. She shows a property, 123 Main Street, one showing. Kim is a one showing, you know, what do they say? One hit wonder, one hitter quitter. She shows once, they go under contract. They like it, right? That's Kim. Now, in her consultation with Amy, Amy said, well, Kim, I've been watching CNN and I heard about this whole thing about I have to pay you. Like, Kim, this 500,000 is what I have to purchase the property. I do not have anything in addition to bring to closing to pay you. So whatever you show me, please show me properties where the seller has agreed to compensate you for bringing me a ready, willing, and able buyer. So Kim said, I got it. I know exactly which property to show you. Kim shows the property. Amy loves the property. Kim remembers, before I make an offer, go under contract, I need to do what? Get it in writing. I need to get in writing that the seller is agreeing to compensate me for bringing Amy as a ready, willing, and able buyer, right? So what are the forms of compensation agreement that we're going to review today? The seller's broker to buyer's broker compensation agreement. The seller's, it's the seller to buyer's broker compensation agreement. This is the modification. The seller to buyer's broker compensation agreement. The seller to buyer's broker modification. And then the for sale by owner commission agreement. I think everybody forgot about that. Did everybody forget about the FSBOs? Right? They need to pay you and you need to get that in writing. Like we had that form before this whole NAR settlement, right? So what does this look like? Seller's broker to buyer's broker compensation agreement. The seller's broker, handout, handout, sorry, forgot. In the chat, check the link, you guys. There is a link to get your handout for today. Just like last week, we have a screenshot of the first page of the agreement that we're reviewing. But if you go to the link in the chat, you'll get sent to you the copies of all the agreements that we're reviewing. So go to the chat really quickly. Let me give you guys 2 seconds to put that information in so it sends it out to you. All right. Can you get the first session too? Minnie, see if you can search for that and drop that in and send it to Ism. All right. All right. So while you guys are pulling that up, I'm going to go over the seller's broker to buyer's broker. Right. The seller's broker to buyer's broker compensation agreement outlines the terms under which a seller's broker, meaning the listing broker, agrees to compensate a buyer's broker for their role in the transaction. I want to be clear that this agreement is between the brokerages, right? It's between the seller's broker and the buyer's broker. As such, if you look at page 2, it is signed by the representative of those two entities. It is signed by the representative of the listing brokerage and the selling brokerage, because this is agreement between the brokerages. Okay. Now I want to highlight, let's finish with the quick description. As compensation is no longer offered through the MLS, you guys know that. There's no longer an offer of compensation in the MLS. The way that this is memorialized is to have this document executed between the parties. So prior to the NAR settlement, you didn't need this because the MLS was the means by which you would enforce, right, the agreement to compensate the buyer's agent. If they said, if the MLS showed 3% cooperating agent compensation, then you knew you were getting your 3%. The only thing that you needed to do was make sure that you printed out a copy of the MLS so that there wasn't some discrepancy because compensation changed while you were out showing the property. Does that make sense? So if you pulled a property, you were going to show it and it showed 3%. You guys know that you were told you should have been trained to print the MLS, right? Just in case it changes to 2.5 while you're on the road, you have proof that when you showed it, it was at 3%. Okay. Now, The next thing is, of course, this agreement specifies the amount, percentage of commission, payment conditions, and any other relevant terms. You can see it's very self-explanatory as to the terms, okay? Here's what I want to point out with regards to seller's broker to buyer's broker compensation agreement. I'm not sure if there's any other brokerages, but I know at a particular point, EXP did not allow for this. They did not allow for seller's broker to buyer's broker because it was their thought process that this arrangement was pretty much doing the same thing that the NAR settlement addressed, which was disclosure. So they felt like if the brokerages were making an agreement concerning compensation, they didn't feel like it was clear that the seller realized that they were the ones compensating the buyer's brokerage. For that reason, and this is the modification, it's just if you're modifying any terms, you don't need much explanation on that, right? If you're modifying any terms of the buyer's brokerage agreement, you're going to use that modification, sign it, get it in writing, get any changes in writing by using the modification, okay? No, but going back to what I was saying, because brokerages like EXP, again, I haven't heard of any others, they believe that the broker-to-broker compensation agreement is effectuating the same issue that created the NAR settlement. They require the seller to buyer's broker compensation agreement, right? Seller to buyer's broker compensation agreement, meaning we need to be clear because the seller is going to sign this one. Because we wanted to be clear, seller, that you're the one that's compensating the buyer's agent, you're going to sign, right? You're going to sign the compensation agreement. And this agreement is now between the seller and the buyer's brokerage, not between the two brokerages. That's the main difference. Everything else is essentially the same, right? Terms of compensation is simply saying the difference is, again, your seller is going to sign this agreement and not the seller's agent. Okay. All right. And again, it just memorializes whatever compensation terms the seller's offering. Now, one thing I'll say before we move to the commission agreement, the next one is the modification. The question is, how do we facilitate this? How do we facilitate getting this signed? Well, one of the easiest things to do is, as a listing agent, for example, have it already executed. You know what the compensation is. So when Kim calls and says, hey, Amy, I'm sorry, hey, Michelle, I'm going to show 123 Main Street. Has your seller set aside any amounts for compensation or for concessions to assist the buyer and pay my commission? Michelle said, yeah, here's what's your email address? Here's the commission agreement, or here's the seller's compensation agreement. Kim gets it, Kim signs it, Kim sends it back. Kim shows Amy the property. They go under contract. They make an offer, right? Michelle's seller accepts the offer. Next week, we're going to talk about the fourth document, rather, because the third is the contract. There's a fourth one. Some of you probably like, Ray Cole, like, are you serious right now? Like, we have this many documents? Yes, you do. That's why we're having this class. By the end of our time together, you're going to realize, particularly as a buyer's agent, you should have your buyer's agreement, your buyer's brokerage agreement. You're going to have a seller compensation agreement, assuming the seller is agreeing to compensate. You're going to have your purchase contract, and then you're going to have the rider, which is the agreement between the buyer and the seller that puts it in writing that the seller is agreeing to either compensate the buyer's agent or provide some type of concession that's going to cover that compensation. Does that make sense? That's literally where we are, guys. You have like 4 documents that you're going to look to have once you are like, all right, we're under contract. Let's go to closing before you get ready to go to this closing table. This way, right? Okay. So seller to buyer's broker modification to compensation agreement. I told you guys that's just literally what are the modifications to the compensation for whatever reason, right? Did we increase compensation? Hey, let's it's possible, right? Are we increasing compensation, right? Are we extending this? This is probably a more likely one. Maybe you need to extend the amount of days that this compensation is agreement is good for, right? So that's your modification. And then lastly is the commission agreement. The commission agreement. This is again when you have a for sale by owner. It has always been necessary for you to get an agreement signed by the seller if it's a FSBO. Why? Because their property was not listed in the MLS, assuming they didn't go with some, one stop or flat fee brokerage. They didn't have access to the MLS. And so there was no compensation in the MLS that you could bind them to. So it was always necessary for you to have a commission agreement executed before you took a buyer to show a property to a FSBO. Someone's probably like, Jesus, I did not even realize that, right? So this has always been the case, but now, since we're discussing it, since we're discussing compensation agreements, of course, we needed to make sure that it was brought to the table and included in our conversation today as we discuss documentation that the agreements that document your compensation from the seller side, okay? So that's also in the package. So one other thing I wanted to make sure that we point out, you're gonna have questions and that's fine. I don't want you to forget that you have access to free legal advice or legal assistance. I won't say advice. I want to make sure I pull that in. If any of you have ever called the hotline, they don't necessarily give you advice. They give you the law. They give you the black letter law. So they'll give you assistance with knowing what the law is concerning a particular issue. With that being said, make sure, I always coach you guys, make sure you have in your phone the hotline to Florida Legal, right? You guys are Florida Realtors. When you renew your membership each year, you get access to a team of attorneys. Many of you have your favorite attorney that you call when you have legal questions. Many of you, that's my number. I love you. However, if I'm on a call, I can't take your call right away, but there's a whole team of attorneys that are waiting for your call. So make sure that you guys have this number saved in your phones, right? For all of your legal questions. Now, let's get to some of your questions. In what circumstances would that manifest where the seller signs directly and not his agent? Oh, again, using, for example, EXP. EXP, again, unless they change their position on this, when all of this first, when the ruling first came down, EXP did not allow for their agents to have, for the listing agent to sign a compensation agreement. They required that the seller sign the compensation agreement because it was their position that provided the most clarity and full disclosure to the seller that they are the ones that are compensating that buyer's brokerage and not anyone else. EXP Realty. Y'all know what I'm talking about? EXP Realty, that's a brokerage. All right. Oh, yes. Next question. So basically, if the seller isn't offering commission and the selling agent decides to give up part of their commission to the buyer's agent, they would sign the broker to, oh, no. So I'm going to read this question. So David said, if the seller isn't offering commission, so they're not offering any compensation, and the selling agent decides to give up part of their commission to the buyer's agent, they would sign the broker-to-broker commission agreement. No. So let's start from the top. That's a good question. I'm glad you got clarity on that. If the buyer's agent is not seeking to be compensated for their time in working with the buyer, then they simply would not enforce their buyer's brokerage agreement. Does that make sense to everybody? Right? That's your agreement to enforce. Your buyer's brokerage agreement says, for example, let's say, for example, your buyer's brokerage agreement says that you'll be paid 3% compensation for working with this particular buyer. And for whatever case, let's use, no, I don't want to use Kim. Kim was like, don't jinx me. For whatever reason, the property that your buyer goes under contract to purchase, I don't know, let's say, for example, something that occurs that they need additional closing costs, and they're just not going to be able to afford to pay you your 3% and the house, like all their closing costs. So you say, you know what, I'll give them a break. I'll just charge them 2%. And you can do that, right? You'll do that. There would be no reason to have the seller involved in that because they never agreed to compensate you anyway. All right, so that's the way you would effectuate that. And I hope that answered your question. If not, let me know. We can go a little bit deeper because we have 3 more minutes. Okay. Which agreement do you feel is better to use, the broker to broker or seller to broker? Honestly, I would say seller for a number of reasons. One, I do agree with EXP's position regarding disclosure. Number two, when it comes to enforcement, I just feel like it's easier to enforce against a seller than a brokerage. And I'm gonna stop there. I'm gonna give you guys my strategy. I'll just stop there. Chandra said, yes, I'm an EXP Realty agent. Chandra, I will put you on the spot. If you were up to date on what they're training, again, they may have changed it. I'm not sure how long you've been with them, but at one point that was their thing. If they're still saying that, you can let me know in the chat. If not, don't worry about it. Remain anonymous. Another question. Anne Marie says, if I'm getting 2 from buyer, but seller is giving 3 to the buyer's agent, what happens? Then that 1%, then you get 3. And but I'm glad you asked that question. Guess what you need? You need to modify your buyer's brokerage agreement because you can never be paid more than what you've agreed to be paid in your buyer's brokerage agreement. Does that make sense? I gotta sneeze. Excuse me. So, I want to make that clear because that's a very good question. Anne Marie said, my buyer has agreed to pay 2%. The seller is offering 3. Wonderful. Congratulations. You need to go and modify your buyer's brokerage agreement to get the 3 instead of 2. Right? Is the seller going to pay the extra 1 and the buyer pay? No, the buyer's not paying 2. The buyer is technically, the seller's paying that, right? The buyer's not paying anything. The seller is paying that because the seller has said they're gonna compensate you. And that's what your agreement says. Your buyer's brokerage agreement says that if another party compensates me, then that will offset what you've agreed to pay me. Okay. All right, Chandra, I see you. Is this next question? I'm still not clear on what circumstances do we use seller to buyer broker when there's a listing agent involved and not broker to broker agreement. Could you clarify, please? Sure. You can use either agreement. You would use the seller, you would use the broker to broker agreement when the broker is saying, I'm going to compensate you. I'm going to compensate you, buyer's agent, right? Meaning it's going to show, for example, on your settlement statement, probably say what this is going to be. The seller has paid has agreed to pay the listing agent 6%. Listing agent says, I'll give you 3, right? So then that 3 is going to be 3 of that 6 is going to be paid to the buyer's brokerage. The other thing that I want you to understand with that is it's about who is required to operate by the terms of this agreement, right? If there's a breach, who are we going to go after? Think about it that way. If there's a breach, who are we going to go after? Are we going to go after the seller or are we going to go after the brokerage? All right. David's question, can you get both parties to compensate you? Sure. Here's how. Let's use our same example. Let's use Anne Marie's same example. Anne Marie's example is her buyer agreed to 3. The seller is offering 1. Seller's going to pay 1. Her buyer's going to pay what? In the chat. Exactly. 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 Marissa said her brokerage does broker to broker only. That's different. EXP, again, as last I heard, they only did seller to broker. Right? These are all very good questions. Any other questions? Any other questions? No? All right.
Nicole.
Yes.
Hi, it's Dave. So,
Hey.
hi, how are you? If the seller is not compensating the buyer's agent and the broker decides to, could we use seller's broker to buyer's broker?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Maybe the seller has said, I'm only paying you, Dave, 3%. Figure it out. Right? And you just have a dog of a property. You're like, I gotta do something. I gotta contribute to this deal some kind of way. And so you say you'll give 1%, right? And however the buyer's agent figures out, the rest of it is how they figure it out. All right. One last point I want to bring up. Unless Dave, you have a follow-up question?
No, that's
Okay,
it.
perfect. One last point I want to bring up. You guys do not need to send into closing your compensation agreements. I know for some reason, I don't know how that became a thing. But you do not need to send us your compensation agreements. The way that we are made aware of what you will be compensated is when you do your intake form. All right. You'll say what you're being compensated, the amount you're being compensated, and who's paying it. And then by the time you get to closing, you just need to make sure that that settlement statement is drafted accordingly, right? So that the compensation is on the appropriate side. All right. All right.
I had a quick question.
Go ahead.
When you close, is there a difference when it's a broker to broker versus seller to broker? Like, is it coming from concessions? I was a little confused on that. Or is it the same, the way the realtor gets paid?
So it's going to be, that's a good question. So Sophia's question of when it's broker to broker, is it different? So technically, I'm going to tell you this, like we have not had that come in yet, but I'm going to tell you what it would look like on a settlement statement. Technically, it would look like the 6%, we'll do 6%. 6% being paid to the listing agent by the seller. So you'll see 6% coming from the seller side to the agent. And then you'll see 3% or whatever been agreed to the selling agent being paid by the listing brokerage.
Got it. And then if it was seller to broker,
You would see just that. You would see the seller paying that to the brokerage. You'll see it on the seller side.
Okay. So it's more so just legal, like you said. It's just
it's more so allocation. That's a very good question. It's all about allocations. And so that's why a subsequent class we're going to have, it's important that you guys know how to review a settlement statement. To know that it was entered on the appropriate side. What you're more going to have, the issue you're more likely to have is, I mean, hopefully this is not the case, but I'm just going to put it out there, is where the seller has said, no, I'm not compensating. Buyer understands that they're compensating. Closing agent is none the wiser of this whole NAR thing, and they just set the file up the way they normally would pre-NAR, right? And they put that 3% charge to the seller for the buyer's agent when it's supposed to be 3% charge to the buyer for that compensation. So as a listing agent and as a buyer's agent, when you look at a settlement statement, you got to make sure you see that compensation as a debit to the buyer and not a debit to the seller on the settlement statement. Okay.
Thank you.
No problem. Very good question. Isa has another question. Sarah Cole, you said, if there's a breach, who are we going to go after? Based on this, it makes me think that each agreement would benefit one or the other. Which would benefit the seller if If we're repping the seller, so we protect him and vice versa, the buyer, we represent the buyer. If I understand your question, first part, you said if there's a breach, who are we going to go after? Correct. Because you can only enforce the agreement against the person that signed it. So if you have the seller's broker to buyer's brokerage agreement, you get to closing and the seller's broker defaults, they don't make the funds available to compensate you, you're going after the brokerage. You're not going after the seller. It's not the seller's fault. Seller didn't agree to that. The brokerage did. If you sign a seller's compensation agreement, then yes, you're going after the seller. However, it is the buyer's broker that's going after the seller and not the buyer per se. Unless you get the addendum signed, which we're going to talk about next week. Don't get concerned. Just think, that's why I say you have four documents. That seller's compensation agreement, the buyer cannot enforce it against the seller because the buyer didn't sign it. That's not an agreement between the buyer and the seller. That's an agreement between the buyer's agent and the seller. However, you're going to see next week that there is a rider that you attach to your purchase contract wherein the buyer and the seller, those are the signatures on that rider that creates the binding agreement between those two parties. So that if you get to closing and the seller does not perform, now the buyer can go after the seller. Does that make sense? You're like, Rico, I did not sign up for this. Yes, you did. That's why you get paid the big bucks. When you're asking the listing agent if they are compensated, should we get that in writing by? Yes. Anne Marie. Guys, what's the writing? What's the writing? What's the writing? All these documents we just talked about. This is your writing. All right. When you ask them if they're compensating, they say, oh yeah, we're compensating 3%. Oh, is that a seller agreement or your brokerage agreement? Can you send that compensation agreement over? And get it signed immediately. Right? You want that signed before you show the property. Especially if Amy has already told Kim, like, Kim, don't show me anything that the seller is not going to compensate you or make some type of concessions that's going to cover your costs. Okay. From Dave, if a seller asked the buyer's agent to see your buyer's brokerage agreement, absolutely not. That's a good question. Absolutely not. That's your agreement with your buyer. That is confidential. There's no reason to show that. But I'm glad you asked that question. That's confidential. That doesn't impact them. Like, what are they gonna do?
Right. Seller or listing agent. You don't have
No one needs to see that. I don't know where that came from. No one needs your agreement with your buyer's agent, but your broker. Do not attach that. Okay, here's an example, Izza. Your buyer's brokerage agreement says that the buyer is going to compensate you 2%, but the seller was ready to pay 3%. They see your agreement. Guess what they're going to pay you? 2%, because that's all you were looking for anyway. Anybody on this training, you better never share your compensation agreement ever again. Fair enough?
Can I just ask you one more question, Nicole? I know you just answered me,
Absolutely.
but so usually when I'm like texting the listing agent,
Yeah.
I ask them via text, hey, are you going to be giving buyer compensation? And they all write yes, 2.5, whatever they're writing.
Yeah.
And at that point, once I then go show the property, you're saying I can get a copy of that from the seller?
You should have got it before then.
Oh, okay, because none of them have said, hey, I'll give you a copy of that. They just answer me in the text like, oh yeah,
Great. Can you send the compensation agreement?
oh, okay. Then none of them are, put it this way, none of them so far that I've texted quite a few.
I
They
believe
just
you.
They write
That
the
and
text.
that's why we are on a mission
Yeah.
to get this thing professional and standard.
I work in Douglas Elliman in New York as well. And in New York, we're just being told to have an email with that, or because we don't have the same paperwork you have in Florida. So we're just being told to get it in writing in an email to have proof, because in New York, we don't have a separate paper for that, like
So
signed
you
paper.
can, so I would get with your broker. I would
Yeah.
show them Florida's agreement and I would
Yeah.
say, can we get something like this drafted for our office? Because
Well, I would
again,
think
the text
they are.
message is not enforceable. It has to be in
Yeah.
writing.
Okay, because I do work for Douglas Elliman. So Douglas Elliman's in Florida as well. And I work at the Douglas Elliman.
Absolutely. So that's a
So-
good point. Yeah, that's forever. Yeah. Like here's what we have in Florida. Can we get something like this in New York?
Yeah, I don't understand why the New York office then is not doing that. They're always just saying, just make sure you have that in writing, in a text message or an email. That's all they keep saying to us. And it's like, all right.
So that's a good point. And so I'll say this, and I said this before, Florida Realtors as an organization did a very good job of being proactive. These are new forms. These are new
Yes.
forms, right? And so the New York Realtors Association, whatever their equivalent is,
Yeah.
they just need to get on the ball because
Listen, I can tell you the difference. I'm doing both Florida and New York, and I can tell you right now, Florida is a lot more efficient.
there
A
you
lot
go.
more.
See, that's the word we're looking for, efficient. Thank
Yes,
you.
you guys are really on it. Let me tell you something. When I compare New York, they're horrifying here. It's just they're not. Listen, I'm also a dentist in New York City, and I
Yeah.
understand. And I can tell you right now, New York is horrifying. Florida is with the program. So just
Look
so you
at
know.
that. Look at that. Y'all should be excited.
Yeah. So
Thanks for sharing that. Thanks for
Yeah,
sharing that.
very-
But efficiency is the name of the game. Exactly.
Yeah, I'm excited to be doing some real estate in Florida as well, and I can see the differences, and it just makes life a little bit easier with what you guys have going on.
Nice.
And I appreciate all your help and everything, because in New York they don't give the same kind of help.
Yep. Well, here,
Yeah.
like I said, we're just getting back to it. This is the second class this year. Last year we were every Thursday a different topic. And so keep this time slot penciled
Yeah.
in. We'll be here.
You're
And
doing a great job. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
not a problem, not a problem.
Yeah.
Let me see. Ilza, guys, one last question. What can be the downfall of not asking for that form? Okay. I'm going to answer your question. Give me 1 second. Let me answer your question. So with that being said, make sure you follow us on Instagram. We're going to be sending out emails and to keep everybody updated. All right. All right.